I've got a proposition and then two questions. Here's the proposition. Higher education in prison is not only good, it's uncommonly good. That's my thesis. Here's the question, the first one. What words or images or ideas, pictures, pop into your brain when I say the word prison? Think about it. I ask my undergraduate students here at the college that question when I talk to them, and they often say things like, oh, prisons are dark or confining or dangerous. It's an understandable list given what they see on TV and in movies. Here's the second question. What words or images or ideas pop into your head when I say the word prisoner? Again, I ask students this question and they say things like lonely or depressed or frightened. And that's not a terrible list either, but my time teaching college courses in prison and watching others do so leads me to know that that list is far too narrow. And it makes me wonder why, when we ask that question, we don't start with the most fundamental things about these people. The fact that they're human beings, or their mothers, sisters, daughters, fathers, brothers, sons, friends, things that we are. We hardly ever start with those kinds of words. Okay. How did I get interested in higher education in prison? How did I come to believe that higher education in prison is an uncommon good? It was a process, and I had to be dragged to it. My friend Jared Ortiz teaches in the religion department here at Hope College, and he came to me one day and he said, I've been teaching a religion class for another college's college and prison program over in Ionia, and it's really the most amazing experience. He said, we should get a group of professors together and do something like that. I said, okay. And he said, I don't really think you're understanding what I'm saying. I said, I don't think I am either. He said, I think you should do that. I said, man, that is the worst idea I've heard in a long time. But to his great credit, he kept sort of needling me a little bit over the weeks. And on a cold, dark February morning in 2018, I found myself in his car heading to Hanlon Correctional Facility in Ionia, Michigan, to watch him teach his class so I could get some idea of what he was talking about. And we walked through the clanging gates of the prison. I was nervous. And walked across the yard. And we walked into the classroom, which looked kind of like a normal classroom. And at 8 o'clock, 40 incarcerated men, age 45 or so on average, start filing through the door and taking their seats, all wearing their state-issued orange and blue uniforms. And at 8:03, a hand went up. And Jared called on this student, and he stood up to ask his question. My students never stand up to ask their questions. And he said, Professor, I wonder if you could help me understand what Irenaeus is trying to say on page 78 of our book, because it seems to stand in stark contrast to what Origen says in the footnote on page 152. I said, what is happening here? And before he can answer the question, 4 hands go up. And so he calls on one of the other guys, and this guy stands up, faces his peer, and said, and this is almost exactly what he said. He said, if my colleague would read with greater care and attention, he would see that Irenaeus goes on to explain himself in more detail on page 98, such that his thesis comports perfectly with what Origen says in the footnote on page 152. And I thought, I don't know what's happening here, but I got to know more about this. And it's 5 years later, and now we have our own college and prison program operating at Muskegon Correctional Facility, and stuff like that happens all the time. What's true about prisons? The first thing you need to know is that U.S. prisons are chock full of our fellow citizens. The per capita incarceration rate in the United States of America leads the world, and number 2 isn't even close. The prison population dipped a bit during COVID, but it's on the way back up. That's the first thing. Prisons, as it turns out, are swirling cauldrons of inequity. They're the most inequitable places in our country. They're inequitable on at least 3 dimensions. Here's one of them. 1 in 10 black men in his 30s is in prison or jail on any given day. I am offended by that number. I remember what I was doing in my 30s. I was building a family, building a career, building a place in the community here, but not these guys. If 10% of this audience all of a sudden just disappeared into a vacuum, our community would be greatly deprived. The other way that prisons are inequitable is that they're pretty much for poor people. People go to prison poor. They get poorer while they're there, and they come out with nothing. And they never catch up. And it's also true that people who are incarcerated are wildly uneducated, with only about a quarter having graduated from high school. So the 3 pillars of inequity are alive and well and swirling in America's prisons. Prisons, it also happens to be true that they're incredibly expensive. 20 cents of every dollar that you send to the state of Michigan in taxes goes for prisons. $2 billion out of a $10 billion general fund. There are lots of good public policy possibilities in that fact. Higher education in prison is one of them. And it turns out that nationwide, prisons aren't particularly good at their jobs, because the recidivism rate, the degree to which people who are released from prison end up reoffending and coming back, is super high. You go out 8 or 9 years, it's about 80%, 8 in 10. That's terrible. Now, I want to say that there is some good news in the state of Michigan, where recidivism is only about 25%. And that puts us in the lowest 10 states in the nation. So we can feel good about it, but not too good, because that's still way too high. There's lots of work to do. Finally, let's think for just a second about the people who work for us, corrections officials, corrections officers. They have very high stress, very difficult jobs. They work in high-threat environments, and you do that long enough, and your risk for suicide and serious mental illness goes way up. And in fact, it's about 3 times higher for this group than it is for all of us in this room right here. And that ought to bother us a lot. I want to tell you about Carlos. Carlos is one of our students in our first cohort in our program. He was taking a nonviolent communication class, and he was in his cell, and his roommate, in prison language, his bunkie, was there with him. And his bunkie is not one of our students. And he says to Carlos, "What are you reading?" And he says, "Well, this is my textbook for my nonviolent communication class." And the bunkie said, "Wow, that sounds kind of interesting. Would you mind if I read the book when you're done with it?" And he said, "Sure." And Carlos's bunkie ended up reading the whole book, doing all the weekly homework, and he wrote all the papers for a class for which he was not enrolled, for a program to which he was not admitted. It's a really good example of how college and prison isn't only good for the students, but has a kind of halo effect into the whole prison. I love that story. Well, what do we want? What's our desire here with this? The first thing we want, among the other things that we want, is that we want prisons where when people leave them, they don't come back. That's a reasonable desire, isn't it? It turns out that education, any kind of education inside a prison, reduces recidivism by about half. If you provide a bachelor's degree, like our program is doing, recidivism drops to 5%. So that's one of the things we want. We want a less violent prison. And there's pretty good evidence to show that when you educate even a small fraction of a prison population, violence in the whole facility reduces. It's not a magic wand, but all of a sudden, the non-enrolled residents of that prison have some good role models to look at. Role models that have shared their experience. People like Carlos. That's good for everybody. We also want to make investments in prison that have a good return. And $1 spent on education, higher education, in prison returns about $5 of savings on reincarceration costs. That's a pretty good return on investment. And we also want prisons that are sensitive to and care about the voices of the victims of crime. And by about a 2-to-1 margin, crime victims definitely want rehabilitation for people that have so badly damaged their families. It's a bit of a counterintuitive statistic, but it's true and it's important. Now, the Michigan Department of Corrections Director, Heidi Washington, has a sort of stated goal that all of the 26 prisons in the state of Michigan system would have some sort of post-secondary educational program. And there's been pretty good progress on that particular goal. In terms of college programs, about a third of the prisons have a college and prison program. We think that could rise to about 50% in the next couple of years, given some of the colleges that are starting to bring programs online. But there's still an awful lot of white space on the map to be able to sort of pull this goal off. But if it can be pulled off, it will have a huge difference on the sort of situation of incarceration in the state of Michigan. I want to tell you about another student. This guy's name is Sean. And Sean was a student in our very first class in the prison. It was a class called What Are People For? It's a kind of a provocative title. Think about that. What are people for? And the very first assignment that Professor David Stubbs made was to ask the students to read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics cover to cover in a week. I said to him, "Dave, I don't know how that's going to go." He said, "I know, let's try it." So we come back in after a week, and David says, "I'm going to put you in some groups, but before I do, does anybody just have any general thoughts about this book, this author?" And Sean raises his hand and gets called on, and guess what he does? Stands up. He says, "Yeah, I've got some thoughts about Aristotle. You know, the first time I read this book, I didn't understand a single word of it. It was like reading a different language, you know? So I read it again." He said, "It was still really hard. I still didn't get it. The third time I read it, I started to see some things that were popping out and connecting. And now that I've read it a fourth time, I can really sort of connect Aristotle's thinking to the lived experience I've had in my life. And as he was saying that, I looked around the room, and 20 other guys are nodding their head. Like everybody read Aristotle cover to cover in a week, 4 times. Amazing. Listen, Sean is now paroled from prison. He's finishing his college degree on the main campus, and he's the contributing author to the book, The Liberating Arts, Why We Need Liberal Arts Education. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Rich is just like telling all the best stories. You know, I'm telling the stories that happen every day we go to the prison. Every single class we have, there's a story like this. This we have come to expect as normal. Okay, what are we going to do? What do I want you to do? The first thing I want you to do is to be encouraged. People who come to TED Talks are not the kinds to be like wired to be discouraged, right? To think that problems are unsolvable. There's lots of problems with the system of incarceration in our country, but lots of them are solvable, or at least they're sort of reducible. Even if they're not, you can't sort of completely solve. You can make them less bad. And higher education in prison is a super good way to help solve some of those problems. And that's really the genius of our country. We can recognize our faults and we care about them and we try to work to correct them. And we can make things better with college and prison. How does any problem in our society get solved? You know, all the usual ways. Talk to your legislator, lobby, campaign, grassroots, donate to college and prison programs. Care about it. Talk to your neighbors about it. Talk to your legislators about it. And only that way do things get better, and I hope that you'll go out and do all of those things. Okay, one more number. This whole TED thing is all about reconnecting by design, right? So here's a reconnecting number. It's 95%. 95% of everyone who's in prison or jail today is coming home eventually. They're coming home to their communities, our communities. So here's the question. How would we have them return? Thank you very much.